Getting into the end of the quarter, we're going to be talking about some systems, digestive and urinary systems that are maybe not something that we're going to be treating directly in physical therapy, but depending on what setting you work in, you are going to be working with people who have disorders of the digestive system or the urinary system, and it's going to affect your therapy session in somehow. So, I always say, no matter what setting you work in, nobody walks in without their digestive system, right? Nobody walks in without their urinary system. So there are issues, there are things you need to know. However, that having been said, maybe you don't need to know the detail as much in this section. So we're not going to have an exam on this part. We're going to have some case studies. You're going to focus a lot of your efforts on probably your other classes this quarter, but we're going to review the function and structure of the digestive system just briefly. We're not going to go over it in the detail that they go in the book. We're going to talk a little bit about nutrition, which is always fun and interesting, and specifically nutrition for recovery of injuries, because that's an important part of what we do. And then we're going to talk about disorders because, what goes wrong, right? So here, just reviewing the digestive system, super minor learning objectives. The major site of absorption of water and electrolytes. I think you could guess what it is. So in the book, they talk a lot about every part of the digestive system. And when you look at this, it's a lot. And I don't expect you to know like every super, super detailed thing, but I like the way this chart is organized. It has the areas in the digestive system and then the events that happen in the digestive system. So you can see if you look down the event side of the chart, the colon absorbs water and electrolytes, and that was our learning objective. So there you go. You know that. So what you know about that is now if you're working with somebody who's had a colostomy, which means ostomy means there's now a new hole, a surgical hole into the outside. So there's some part of their intestine that is not functioning, and so they're not absorbing water and electrolytes the same. So that's going to affect their fluid balance, their electrolyte balance, and potentially their acid-base balance. So, think of that in terms of that. So the digestive system, its job is to process ingested food and fluids, break them down with enzyme. We have mechanical breakdown with chewing. We have chemical breakdown in the stomach, and we have chemical breakdown throughout the intestines with enzymes. It's controlled by enzymes. And a lot of our hunger and thirst, and well, not thirst so much, but hunger and satiation, how satisfied we are with our food, is controlled by enzymes and controlled by hormones as well. So the digestive system absorbs those necessary components that we need for cellular metabolism and just keeping our body going. There are membrane transport mechanisms that get the nutrients into the bloodstream, and those are mostly in the small intestine. And then the reabsorption of water and electrolytes happens mostly in the large intestine. So the whole digestive system, sometimes called the gastrointestinal tract, some people call it the gut. It's basically a long hollow tube that goes through the trunk of the body. And then it has accessory structures, the pancreas and the glands and everything, and the stomach. But it's basically one big long tube, and it's all wrapped up so it fits neatly inside of our body. Nifty, right? So the whole digestive tract, that whole tube, has some layers of the wall of it. It basically has 5 continuous layers: mucosa, the submucosa, circular smooth muscle layer, the longitudinal smooth muscle layer, and the visceral peritoneum. So that's the serosa. So the inner layer, it is the mucosa cells. So those are those mucus producing cells, and it protects the tissue and facilitates passage of whatever we eat along the tube. So the cells in the mucosa are epithelial cells, and they have a rapid turnover rate because there's wear and tear from food going through. And they also have a rapid reproduction rate. So cells in the mucosa are able to regenerate and reproduce. They're mitotically active. So they're some of the few cells in our body when we're in adults that actually are. So they're constantly regenerating, which is great. We love that stuff. All the little details about the different layers, you don't need to know that. If you want to, go nuts, read all about it. But I'm not going to ask you anything about it. So the two smooth muscle layers are responsible for transporting food, or the mobility or motility of our digestive system. So we have one that goes around the tube and one that goes along the tube, and those working together with the sympathetic nervous system basically help peristalsis. They help move the food down the tube, basically. So the outer layer the visceral peritoneum or the serosa, and I didn't really talk about the submucosal layer, but it's all your connective tissue and blood vessels and lymphatics and whatnot. So that's where the nutrients are going to end up going, basically. So the visceral peritoneum or the serosa is a large serous membrane in the abdominal cavity, or the peritoneum is, and the parietal peritoneum covers the abdominal wall and the surface of the some of the organs, and the visceral peritoneum is surrounds the organs. And so the idea is you have those two different surfaces, and so things can move. Things have to be able to move, or they don't work. So just like our heart has to be able to move to beat, and our lungs have to be able to move, our digestive system has to be able to move as well. So if somebody has a bowel obstruction, that is a serious medical emergency. They're going to get admitted to the hospital because that's you need to really take care of it. So if you have an infection of the peritoneum, that's one of the top 10 things that can kill you, peritonitis. So it's pretty serious stuff in there. Even though we don't think about it much in terms of physical therapy, it is an important system, and it's what gets the nutrients that we need to run our body, basically. So the upper gastrointestinal tract is the oral cavity, the pharynx, which is responsible for swallowing, and the esophagus. So the esophagus is closed off except when you swallow. Basically, in our oral cavity, we start with the mechanical breakdown of food. We chew it. There's some chemical digestion that goes on. It forms the food bolus that's going to go down the esophagus. And then the pharynx is innervated by the cranial nerves, and it controls swallowing. The esophagus has the glottis, which closes except when you're swallowing, and that's to keep you from getting food and fluids down into your lungs, basically. So the esophagus normally is closed unless you're swallowing, and then it's open. It has smooth muscle, and it starts moving the food down to the stomach. So the stomach is an expandable muscular sac. It acts as a reservoir for food and fluid. There are lots of layers of muscles. So some of the parts of the tube of the gastrointestinal tract have some extra features, and the stomach is one of them. So instead of just having that circular and longitudinal muscle, it also has oblique muscles, because the stomach really has to churn and mix the food. So the initial digestion of proteins by pepsin happens in the stomach, and it's formed by a combination of pepsinogen, which is a protein, and an enzyme, and hydrochloric acid. So hydrochloric acid breaks up pepsinogen into pepsin, which is the digestive enzyme. In the stomach, we also have cells that produce intrinsic factor that are essential for the absorption of vitamin B12 in the ileum. And so we talked about that in the blood chapter when we talked about pernicious anemia. So if you're not producing that intrinsic factor, you can't absorb vitamin B12, and then there are all sorts of symptoms that are associated with that, one of them being anemia. So the stomach churns everything up, starts digesting the proteins, and it forms chyme. And chyme is like a mixture of food and acid. And the stomach also absorbs some of the small lipid-soluble molecules. So there's all sorts of interesting information specifically about the stomach. We're not going to talk in that much detail about it. The esophagus goes right into the stomach, and then the small intestine starts right as you exit the stomach. There are sphincters on either end that keep food in the stomach when it's supposed to be there and empty it out when it's not supposed to be there. Sometimes disorders associated with it empty too soon or too late, or there can be different problems with that. So we'll talk about that when we talk about disorders. Also, if the sphincters aren't working, if the esophageal sphincter isn't working, you can get acid reflux up into the esophagus. It causes pain. If you have patients that have acid reflux, you kind of want to avoid having them lie flat because it can exacerbate the problem. So the liver is the metabolic factor for the body. The liver is one of those amazing organs, like the kidneys, where there are tons of repeated arrangements of cells that do a lot of the same function, and there's so many of them. And the reason why there's so much duplication is that we absolutely cannot live without the function that the liver provides for us, just like we absolutely cannot live without the function that the kidneys provide for us. So if your liver fails, unless you get a transplant, you are not going to live. So liver is super important. It receives blood from the hepatic portal vein. It transports nutrients from the intestine to the liver, and the nutrients are stored in the hepatocytes. Hepatocytes are liver cells. And they play a role in carbohydrate, protein, and fat metabolism. So if we have extra nutrients, they get stored, and then the liver decides, or the body decides when the liver is going to release them. And a lot of that's controlled hormonally. A lot of the hormones are produced in the pancreas, and we'll talk about that. The liver also plays a role in the production of plasma proteins and clotting factors. Really important. It also plays a role in the breakdown of old and damaged erythrocytes, and it produces bile as a byproduct of its function. But bile also is part of our digestive process. So the liver, it has its hand in almost every part of what's going on. Nutrients, the metabolism of nutrients, and the metabolism of medications. So a lot of medications get processed in the liver before they go out to have their effect in the body. So the liver is really important. The other thing that is interesting about the liver is it has those repeated bundles of hepatocytes, and it repairs itself sort of constantly. So this is another area of the body where there's a lot of mitosis. So you go out, you do stuff that's going to damage your liver. Alcohol and drugs, those are things that damage your liver. Medications, they also could potentially damage your liver. But the liver can repair itself if it has enough time, nutrients, and reason to do it. So really a super interesting part of the body, I think. The pancreas is another very interesting part of the body that you really need in order to live. So there are two different parts of the pancreas. There's the exocrine pancreas, which they're arranged in lobules. And then there's and the exocrine pancreas produces all the digestive enzymes that not that the stomach doesn't produce, stomach and the rest of the digestive system. So trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, ribonuclease, pancreatic amylase, bicarbonate ions, that's important for acid-base balance. So that's another source of them besides the kidneys. And look, there it is, nestled amongst the kidneys and the spleen. So they're all kind of working it out there, figuring out what we need. All of that whole list of enzymes, do I want you to memorize that? I do not. But just suffice it to say that the exocrine pancreas is highly involved in digestion. So when you have pancreatitis, you have trouble digesting and processing nutrients. Pancreatitis is inflammation of the pancreas. It can be acute, it can be chronic. We'll talk about it. The pancreatic duct joins the bile duct coming from the liver and gallbladder to enter the duodenum, which is the upper part of the small intestine. And the exocrine pancreas secretes all of its digestive enzymes into that duodenum, upper part of the small intestine. The endocrine pancreas, on the other hand, produces some very important hormones and substances. So there are 4 different kinds of cells, and there are more cells that they're finding all the time too. So they have these cells called the pancreatic islet cells, and they within the pancreatic islet cells, there are 4 different varieties of cells. So the alpha cell produces the hormone glucagon. Low blood glucose levels stimulate the release of glucagon from the liver. They from the pancreas, and then the glucagon goes to the liver and says, we need you to bust out some glucose for us. And the liver will do that because it has some stored. The beta cells in the endocrine pancreas produce insulin. So elevated blood glucose levels stimulate the release of insulin. So you have a lot of glucose in your blood. Glucose needs one of 2 things to get into the cells. It needs insulin to escort it into the cell, or it needs exercise. So you got to have both. One or the other. So exercise can act like insulin for getting glucose out of the blood and into the cells, but you also need insulin. The delta cell in the endocrine pancreas secretes the peptide hormone somatostatin. It's also released by the hypothalamus and the stomach and the intestines. It's an inhibiting hormone. It inhibits the release of both glucagon and insulin. Interesting. So there's this balance between, is your blood glucose too low? Is it too high? Do you want to inhibit the release of both of those things? There's another cell called the PP cell that secretes pancreatic polypeptide hormone. How do you like that name? And that's where the PP comes from, pancreatic polypeptide. It has a role in appetite and the regulation of the pancreatic exocrine and endocrine secretions. So the cells of the exocrine pancreas are arranged in lobules. They secrete the digestive enzymes, electrolytes, and water into tiny little ducts, which eventually drain into the main pancreatic duct, and that joins the common bile duct and then enters the duodenum. So you've got the pancreatic islets controlling what you're going to release, and then you've got things being released. So very interesting. It's a really complicated organ too. And people who have type 1 diabetes, like we talked about in the last chapter, there's something wrong with their islet cells and they cannot produce insulin. People who have type 2 diabetes, they can still produce insulin, but there's something wrong with the absorption of the insulin, or the cells are insulin resistant. So you have high blood sugar. So the pancreas is another one of those organs that you can't live without. The spleen, you can live without that. I mean, it's no fun, but you can. And it limits your immune response, but not horribly so. But you can't live without the kidneys, you can't live without the pancreas, you can live without the spleen. So once we got out of the pancreas, out of the liver, we're into the small intestine. So the 3 parts of the small intestine, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. All of the small intestine has all these folds of the mucosa on the inner layer that are called villi. And then microvilli are folds of the cell membranes of those individual mucosa cells. And the folds serve to increase the surface area for absorption. So the small intestine is the major site for absorption of nutrients. There are lymphatic vessels in the small intestine that are called lacteal vessels, and they help with the absorption of fluids. It's the site of production of mucus to help the food move through, and a bunch of different enzymes. Enterokinase, I'm not going to expect you to remember that list, but lots of enzymes that break down our food and get the nutrients out of it. So yay, that's a good thing. We want the small intestine. So when people have issues like Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disease that affects the small intestine. So it affects your digestion and they get poor absorption of nutrients. The lower GI or large intestine also has lymphatic tissue. They're called Pear patches in the lower GI. It has a lot of resident normal flora to help break down certain food materials. So we have bacteria in our large intestine that synthesize vitamin K, and vitamin K is important in blood clotting and the whole blood clotting process. So the lower intestine is the major site for fluid and electrolyte reabsorption. So basically, your food goes through and the stomach churns it all up, and the pancreatic and bile enzymes break down the food. The nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine and some of the fluid, and then the rest of the fluid and electrolytes are absorbed in the large intestine. And then what's left is formed into solid feces. And out it goes, hopefully. Ideally, out it goes. But you can see that it's pretty convoluted at the little path that it takes. Going from, and the appendix is that itty bitty little thingy, and you can see how something could get caught in there and it could get infected and you end up with appendicitis, and it has to be removed. But so you can think of the small intestine as the major site for nutrient absorption and the large intestine as the major site of fluid and electrolyte reabsorption. And so when we talk about the disorders, think about how that is going to affect things. So lots of different digestive enzymes and their actions. I'm not going to expect you to memorize these or anything, but just know that there are lots of them. Lots of them are created in the pancreas, some in the intestinal mucosa. Their job, the digestive enzymes, is to break up the food into digestible nutrients. So, and it says what each one does. It's lovely to have that little chart, but I don't expect you to know every single one of them. Most of them by their name, you can tell what they do. Lipase, it breaks up fat. Amylase breaks up starches. Nuclease break up nucleic acid. Peptidase breaks up proteins. So, their name kind of tells you all. Sucrase breaks up sugar. So their name reveals a lot. So the hormones that control the digestive tract organs and their function, gastrin is produced by gastric cells. It's stimulated by food in the stomach, protein, caffeine, or the high pH of chyme. So chyme has high pH because of the hydrochloric acid that the stomach produces. And it promotes gastric emptying. So it increases gastric secretions and motility and promotes gastric emptying. So that's good because you want the food to get mixed up and partially dissolved, and then it needs to go out so the nutrients can get absorbed. You don't want to just hang out in your stomach. Cholecystokinin is produced by the intestinal mucosal cells. I'm not going to expect you to remember all these either. But it's stimulated by protein and fat in the duodenum, and it inhibits gastric secretions in motility. So a lot of hormones, there's like opposite effects, like insulin and glucagon have opposite effects. Gastrin and cholecystokinin have opposite effects. Cholecystokinin stimulates gallbladder contractions and the release of bile, and it stimulates pancreatic enzyme contractions. So people who have gallstones, a lot of times when they eat protein or fat, it causes the gallbladder to contract, and then they get pain from those stones. So something to think about. You can see there's some of the other ones. There are neural controls from the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So I always talk about the sympathetic nervous system as being the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic as being the rest and digest. So the digest part, the parasympathetic nervous system is stimulated by the taste of food, and it increased secretions and peristalsis to move the food through the system. The sympathetic nervous system decreases secretions and peristalsis and stimulates vasoconstriction in the mucosa, because if you're going to run, you don't have time to sit there and digest, right? That's just the way I think of it in my mind. You can think of it however you want, but parasympathetic is rest and digest, and so it promotes peristalsis, and sympathetic decreases peristalsis because we have to run, we can't digest.